Good afternoon, at least good afternoon in Brooklyn, New York. I'm Andrew Meier. I'm going to be playing the moderator today. I'm going to try to keep my mouth shut and really let our incredible honored panelists speak. Going to be very brief with introductions of both TJ Stiles and Rebecca Donner. Their bios are on the website, and if you're here, you no doubt know who they are, and more importantly, have read their works. First with you, Rebecca. Rebecca, in case you've been living on another planet, is the author of most recently New York Times bestseller, All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days. Her bio was recently updated because now, Rebecca, congratulations, you're the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography, and the Penn Jacqueline Bogart Weld Award for biography. It was not only a New York Times bestseller, it's a New York Times notable, New York Times editorial editor's choice. Somewhat, thank you. And it's been named to a whole slew of best books of last year, too many to enumerate. You, Rebecca, were also honored as a fellow at the Leon Levy Center for Biography. You've taught at a number of esteemed universities, and most recently, you were just named a Guggenheim Fellow. So congratulations and welcome.
Thank you, Andrew.
TJ, it's an honor to have you as well. The list of accolades and accomplishments would take up most of the next hour. In short, there are very few people on the planet who can say they've won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and I should note was a finalist in a second category for one of those. A number of fellowships, TJ, you've won, and honors. Most importantly, I think, for this crowd, you serve on the Bio Advisory Board, so thank you for that. You're also on the Society for American Historians, the Authors Guild. I know you've done your time there, and you are the author of an amazing trio, all of whom I think managed to figure in the book that I think we're going to focus on today, on Custer, but Jesse James, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and George Armstrong Custer. And I think you're now writing, I believe you're still writing, always a dangerous question to ask any writer, but certainly an introduction, a biography of Teddy Roosevelt, TR. So I hope we'll hear something of that enterprise as well. It's truly an honor. You folks, you're in for a treat. These are 2 of the best writers we have working today in biography, and in extremely different ways. In reading your works, it struck me as a kind of preposterous enterprise pairing you together, especially on the topic of suspense, because when you think of someone like Custer, as TJ says in his book again and again, what more can be said? Probably one of the most researched and written about people even in his day, but certainly whatever it is, 140 years later. And Rebecca is writing about, as I'm sure many of you know, Mildred Harnack, a woman who was almost forgotten, and who really set a course for herself of, as you say, Rebecca, right at the start of self-erasure. So they're 2 very, very different enterprises, but I would argue, and I'm going to promise to keep my mouth closed, that in many ways, the enterprise you both set, Custer and Mildred, both have a great deal in common, both in their themes and in their structure. And what we're really going to look at is craft, in particular, suspense. How you define suspense, how you build suspense. And I wanted to begin with a very quick question. Lawrence Wright, who's written a number of books, but he wrote one on the aftermath and what led us to 9/11, called The Looming Tower. And I heard him give a talk, and he gave a great question. He said, how do you write a book about 9/11 when everybody knows the ending? And I think that's the same, certainly when you begin an enterprise, like writing a new biography of Custer, and also when you write a biography of a woman whose most famous act was her beheading. So I don't know who to begin that with, but it's a question to both of you. Rebecca, do you want to start?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you put that right out front, Andrew. The idea of Mildred's beheading was, in fact, the most sort of formidable challenge that I had when approaching this biography. Yes, Mildred Harnack was a somewhat obscure, a rather obscure figure, but if anybody knew anything about her, it was the fact that she was beheaded by guillotine. It's a very provocative fact, and it tends to sort of eclipse everything else. And so one of the first questions I had in writing this biography was, do I lead with that? Do I lead with the fact that she was executed by guillotine? Or what do I lose and what do I gain by doing that? And I went through many drafts trying out different approaches, but I did want to utilize suspense as well. I mean, and how do I artfully employ suspense in doling out this information? There's nothing really to be doled out. It's a very definitive fact. However, the circumstances surrounding her beheading, how did she get there, and who was she, and what acts did she do that brought her to that point? Those are all questions, of course, that the reader doesn't know, and that it's my job as a biographer to answer. So I can speak more in detail about just how I manage that, but just generally speaking, in both my author's note, my introduction, and the first chapters, this was a key focus for me. How do I let the reader know that this was how she died in a way that doesn't, that keeps them wanting to turn the page and asking themselves, well, how did this happen?
That's exactly what I did, is I turned the page again and again and again. And I read your book and I'm sure many people here, in about 3 days. And then I turned back to Custer, which I had read when it came out. And I did exactly the same thing. And I really do think that it's not an overstretch to talk about suspense. TJ, was there a moment when you realized, I've got to find a way not only to change the camera angle, as you say, on Custer, but also to come at it in exactly the same way Rebecca's saying? We all know Little Bighorn, but what came before?
Yeah, this is Rebecca really pointed to some of the real questions, real issues that we grapple with when we're dealing with actual people whose outcome is known and often very famous. So there you're dealing with an overall arc of a life story in which certain key points, or at least the ending, may be known, and yet there are parts that aren't known. And in sorting out how to deal with that, I think it's helpful. One of the most useful books that I've found that has really codified a lot of the way I think about it is David Lodge's The Art of Fiction, which is a great handbook for people who is very thought-provoking. And he talks about the importance of building expectations, because kind of in the loosest sense, suspense is getting the reader to know that you're going someplace and having expectations. As he puts it, I think your job is to raise questions in the mind of the reader and delay the answers. So the reader wants to know, and there can be any kind of range of questions. You could be even making an argument, you're revealing knowledge. And he subdivides this. I think it's kind of a helpful schematic, the subdivision between suspense and mystery. And when we're writing biography, this is what I think Rebecca really went right at the heart of. You're dealing with a combination of suspense and mystery. Suspense is when you don't know what's going to happen next. So even in a life as well known as Custer's, people are not everyone is going to know every episode in that life. And so you can frame segments and episodes and arcs within that larger life story in which people do not know what's going to happen next, and you want them to be hanging on the edge of their seat. You can also create what I call kind of not suspension of disbelief, but suspension of foreknowledge, where if you're telling the story well, the reader sort of wills herself to not know what happens next, even though they actually know. And really, it's wonderful to read really skillful nonfiction narrative writers who get you to feel like it could go somewhere, some other way, even though you actually know it won't. The other way of thinking about it is in terms of mystery, which is there's a dead body on the floor, and the question is, how did we get there? This is the outcome, and we don't know how we got to that outcome, which is sort of overlaps what I was just talking about. So, often, I found myself starting books with the death of my subject, because that tells the reader where we get to, and the fact that people at the time cared and saw all kinds of significance in this person's life. And then that frames the story that's going, how do we get there? How do we get to the point, not just where they die, but where people actually care about it and where it has significance? And so, that's kind of framing the way I think about it. The specific details, of course, are there are all kinds of techniques to go about getting there.
Well, we're going to get into a couple of those details at least. And one of them, I think, is your voice. And TJ, your voice, it actually in all three of your books, but certainly in the Custer, is what I kept coming back to. We're going to talk about research, but in how you see research fulfilling exactly serving those purposes you just talked about. But your voice, there's a kind of a bedrock, and I don't have the right word for it. Maybe someone can come up with it. It's a kind of a granite voice, what the English call sound. And I just want to quote a couple of things. It's the narration, clothing is communication. Intelligent people tend to be complicated. These are not contiguous quotes. The seams in time appear obvious to us. A graduation, a wedding, a victory parade, yet the seams are never stitched in time itself. And so you keep coming back to, you don't overdo it, you don't overdo anything, but there's that narrative voice, which is someone you really trust, who's going to shepherd us along. And similarly, Rebecca, one of the things that I thought really right from the beginning, because you had this kind of structural dilemma, you made a decision early on, and these are both obviously decisions. Your voice is very different than the kind of bedrock granite I'm saying that TJ has, at least in Custer. She preferred anonymity, so I will whisper her name. Right from the beginning, there's a familial, there's an intimacy, it's a very personal voice. No one follows him that day. This is skipping ahead. But suppose you did. You're both talking directly to us, your readers. But you're talking in very, very different registers, very, very different tones. And again, I felt in reading these for this week that really builds suspense in a kind of a very almost unimaginable way. But so, is there a way you can talk a little bit about the decisions behind your voices?
Well, I would say, yes, I wanted to establish a connection with the reader right up front, and I wanted the reader to feel a strong narrative hand. I will guide you through this while I reveal and conceal information. And I think that that's important because you can, if you try to employ suspense in a kind of gimmicky way, in an inauthentic way, it can frustrate the reader, and so you have to do it artfully. And when you are concealing information, and eliding facts, which is one very excellent way of creating suspense, telling the reader just enough but not everything, and leaving the expectation that I will develop this character, this point, this fact later on, but this is all you need to know right now. That needs to be done in a way that's artful and that doesn't feel like I'm just going through my bag of writerly tricks and saying, you wanted to know that, but I'm not going to tell you right now. Don't you want to turn the page?
TJ, is that the only way?
Sorry, I got caught up listening to her. I wasn't ready to respond. I think that really, again, that goes to a key point, which is authenticity and honesty with the reader. If the reader feels that you're working at it, you're faking it, you're trying too hard, it doesn't work. I mean, we have a lot of people who are viewing our discussion right now. Some of you have never written anything, and some of you, I'm sure, have already published. And there, that there are a lot of ways of doing biography. And the question is, what works? Well, it works if it works. So, but it's got to seem true. It's got to come across authentically. So, my view about biography when it comes to voice is that, I see biography, for me at least, as a meeting ground of scholarship and literature. And the scholarship is about investigating things that are important to you, about founding what you write in fact and research and interpretation and thinking about the world, in my case, in the past. But literature is about the human condition. It's about what it means to be a human being moving through the world. And so that attitude has to come in throughout the book at times when I state things directly. And if I have any kind of wisdom, I think that's a part of the writing. Again, it can't be overdone. It also comes through in a sense of the complexity of characters. And that this is also something Rebecca referred to, that your characters have to, Ian Forster said in aspects of the novel, he famously categorized characters as either flat or round, and that you need both when you're writing. He's talking about fiction, but it's true for nonfiction. A flat character is going to be the same all the time. They're predictable. They're true to that. You can describe them, and they're going to be true to that description. Unfortunately, in the archives, people are often very flat. But we all know from experience that people are round. They're capable of surprising you convincingly. So they're going to be contradictory. They're going to have motivations that seem to them to be perfectly sound. And so, when we're talking about suspense, we're bringing in that knowledge of the characters we're dealing with, the fact that they have their own agendas, and that we're creating a sense of those agendas conflicting, that people want something. And sometimes they want things they don't quite realize themselves. And they have conflicting impulses. And so the villain in your scene or in your story no one's the villain in their own story. And so you think about how things look to them, and then that's a way of creating complexity and of having surprising things happen. It's related to that voice that you talked about, that sense of the world, the sense of what it means to be human. And then you can bring that into your narrative as well, your narrative structure.
Yeah, it's a great point, TJ. And one of the things I was struck again in two very different narratives was you were both in one way fighting against, but also embracing this sense, exactly as you're saying, of flat characters. Well, this happened, the fallacy of the historian, the fallacy of the biographer. So this happened, so therefore it had to have happened. There was the ineluctable march of time. Okay, even in the best of histories, there's always chronology. Chronology, we're taught, is your friend. And yet, when you're in the archives, and Rebecca, you were in attics and in archives on several continents, you're also looking for something else. And in both of your cases, you had moments of incredible discovery, which in and of themselves are suspenseful. But then you recreate that in the page. And I think, TJ, it's a question about, you raised psychology, the emotional vectors behind these characters. Rebecca, was there a moment when you said, do I retain the suspense of the digging, of the research? You're both incredible researchers. I buried the lead at the top there, but this isn't about the research. This is about, you don't publish your notes, you publish a story. So was there a time, Rebecca, when you could point to, or you can now say, I knew that there was a letter or there was a fragment in a dossier that I could use in the way you were saying, very artfully, reveal and don't reveal at all?
Oh, there were plenty of documents that I found that I felt I'm trying to understand the question, so that you're wondering about if I found something in my archival research that would allow me to sort of use it to reveal information, or not use it in order to conceal something.
Yeah, or that really surprised you, that challenged that notion of an ineluctable. You know, this woman was committed. This woman was committed. This is what she did. She was killed.
Right.
Custer was gallant. Custer was an incredible soldier. And then I learned something in the archive. I learned something about Mildred that surprised me and changed and deepened the psychology of the character.
Most assuredly. I think that the period of time when Mildred was in prison, she was in prison for 3.5 months in solitary confinement. She was not allowed to speak to anybody, receive letters, write letters. So as a biographer, I felt my hands were tied. How do I describe that time? But I knew dramatically it would be of great interest for me to provide sensory details, to get a sense of what was going on with Mildred at that time. How do I do this? And so I went to the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand, the German Resistance Memorial Center, a number of times in Berlin. And one of my discoveries was a series of notes that women, her co-conspirators, women co-conspirators had written in prison. And it was an astonishing discovery because they passed these notes back. This was the way they communicated with one another. Mildred actually did write some notes, and then they were confiscated and used against her by her Gestapo interrogator. One member of the group had actually turned her in that way, hoping to save her own skin, which didn't happen. She also met the same fate as Mildred. But so I don't have those notes. I do have the notes from these other members of her group, and they provided me not only with a sense of the day-to-day events that one would experience in prison, when meals were, what the sounds were like, what the interactions with the prison guards were like. There were some prison guards that were sympathetic, or at least one who, in a post-war testimonial, talked about how when they had air raids and the lights went out, she would open the cells and allow the women to communicate with each other during that period of time before then the lights went back on again. There was one of these notes that described a woman during an air raid running to the bathroom because she, this is rather explicit, but she didn't have a bathroom, and so it was a great, she wanted nothing more than to use a real bathroom for just that time during the air raid, rather than a bowl in her prison cell. And these notes describe the pattern of the shadow on the prison wall, the sound of the bird outside. I mean, some of them were like prose poems, and some were just relaying gossip and news. And in one of these notes, I learned that Mildred, it was speculated, was losing her mind. So this really helped me engage with a sort of the question of her mental health while she was in solitary confinement, and it came right up against the kind of like mythologies that surround Mildred Harnack as this strong woman through and through who never batted an eyelash, and these are these sort of generalized and completely unrealistic narratives about her. Of course, she had moments of doubt. Of course, she had moments of weakness. And during solitary confinement, she may have had moments of where her sanity was right on the brink. So that really allowed me to bring in nuance, both in describing her and also tell a little bit with more detail just about, sort of by implication, once I describe the other women and describe their experience in prison, we can have a sense at least of what Mildred is experiencing. After the 3.5 months, she was given a cellmate because she was some of the guards thought that she might be suicidal. And that cellmate, whose name was Gertrude, wrote 2 letters after the war that described in detail their conversations, the food they ate, and also Mildred's basically the stories she would tell and so forth. And that enabled me to then use the primary source documents to explicitly say, this is what happened during this period of time. But during that 3.5-month period where there was just a big black hole, that discovery of those prison notes at the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand, they were pure gold.
And at the time you realized that you had just discovered gold.
Yeah.
It's the question of secondary characters, which actually we were talking about psychology, but TJ, I know you've written about the importance with suspense, but also in knowing your own characters and in telling the story. Secondary characters, actually in Custer, in a very same way that Rebecca just spoke about, not just Mildred, but those who were in prison and in the resistance with her. You had an opportunity to not only revisit Custer and the mythologizing around Custer, but also talk about women, talk about race, and in many ways, they steal not only scenes, his wife Libby and their formerly enslaved cook and the woman who ran the household, Eliza Brown, actually steal the story, I thought, at times. Can you tell us a little bit about secondary characters and their role in building suspense and this kind of psychologizing that giving a deeper nuance that Rebecca was talking about?
Sure. Yeah, I think that she raised a lot of really great points. And when you're doing research, you're not just gathering in string about your main character. You have to see characters emerging in the archives. And when you change point of view, I think changing point of view can be a really great tool because it creates a variety in the storytelling that is just great for the readers. I've even told in Custer's trials, I talked about how Custer wooed the woman he eventually married, Libby Bacon. And I told it first from his perspective and the way he saw it, and then from her perspective in the next chapter. And it looked very different to her. And those secondary characters, beyond simply varying the storytelling and kind of making it more interesting, they can serve so many purposes. One is that, again, you have a sense of conflicting agendas, and the fact that it's not just your main character plowing through the world, it's that the main character is coming up against other people who have other desires, and they sometimes have conflicting agendas, creating conflict or complications. So, I think of, for example, in Master of the Senate, Robert Caro has this, when he brings in LBJ's relationship with Hubert Humphrey and how he used Humphrey to get to the liberals in the Senate, he doesn't just talk about it from LBJ's point of view. He starts a chapter with Humphrey's story. And so you come into that relationship from the other side as well. Or Jean Strauss in her biography of J.P. Morgan, she uses a secondary character to expand the story and to turn a sort of the rise of an institution, the Morgan Library, into a personal story that's about race and gender. So she starts off by talking about the librarian that Morgan hired, Bella da Costa Green, and how she told the story about herself, that she was Portuguese and et cetera, et cetera. And then she says everything she said about herself was wrong. She was the daughter of the first Black graduate from Harvard. And so she takes apart what seems like an inert part of J.P. Morgan's story, the making of a library, by definition, the kind of flat institutional story. And it becomes a story about what's going on in America far beyond, finance and the super wealthy person. And it's a wonderful way when you want to make your book about something else, or when you want to make your main character more likable. Not necessarily the person likable, but to engage the reader's identification with your characters and with your story. So Custer was almost frustratingly three-dimensional. He was possessed with all kinds of demons and capabilities as well. And he was constantly frustrating me and irritating readers, I'm sure. So I was both trying to expand the story by bringing in and really looking at the perspective of his wife, and also this woman he hired at a contraband camp, a camp for people who had liberated themselves and the army was holding them. And this young teenage Black woman, he hired her as his cook, and she took that position and turned it into a lot more. And so her story, she becomes this vivid, interesting character with her own agenda. And then she has conflicts with Libby, and they're both likable, even though they're both, sometimes in conflict, sometimes allied. And so it was a way of bringing in characters that the reader is simply going to like more frequently, more consistently than they like Custer. So when you're dealing with a difficult character, sometimes bringing in a secondary character who is simply more identifiable can really be helpful. I mean, in terms of suspense, in terms of storytelling, in terms of the breadth of your book and what you want it to be about, thinking about your subjects, the people who come up as characters and their perspectives and what their lives are about, it can serve any number of purposes. And I get a little frustrated with biographies that are a little too relentlessly focused just on there's some good biographies that do that, some great ones, but I want a little relief. I want it to be about more than just the perspective of the main character. And so that's what I try to do in my book.
And it really not only opened up the book, it also opened up Custer in a way that we hadn't seen him, at least I hadn't, because you're really talking about race, you're talking about racism, you're talking about the roles between men and women. And his wife was certainly no slouch, intelligent and forceful. And then the relationship between the two women. It also opens up a narrative in which you can see Custer in a dilemma. As you say, that was I wanted to reiterate that, frustratingly in 3D. These are both characters with contradiction. I think we're getting an echo. Sorry, at least I am. Apologies. Full of contradictions, as we all are. And there is a secondary, maybe even a tertiary character who I think is unnamed, 9-year-old girl in your book, in Custer's trial. And that moment, it's secondary characters and then small moments. And this is, again, I don't know if Lodge talks about it in The Art of Fiction, but it's certainly in every good fiction workshop that I've ever been involved in. Small moments explode them. And it's really at the heart of the story of Custer and your story of Custer. Can you just take a minute and reprise that?
Sure. This is important to think about. What matters to you as a biographer. Like I said, my approach is I'm thinking about it in literary terms, which is a lot of what we're talking about, but also scholarly terms. I'm drawn to the subject because it touches on huge issues that I think are really important. And so, as well as the fact that, of course, when you have a well-known subject, you want to know more about the aspects of that person's life that have not been written well about. And so there was this period after the end of the Civil War when Custer, who really had played a deservedly starring role in combat as a cavalry leader in the Civil War and the battles in the East, he was deployed to Texas. And this is usually wrapped up or almost skipped over in a lot of biographies. And I thought, what's happening in Texas at the time? Texas was a place where slavery actually got stronger during the Civil War because Union armies didn't penetrate. And so enslaved people were being shipped there from the rest of the Confederacy as it was being occupied. And Custer is on occupation duty. And so I went through that question, that interest. How is he dealing with the death of slavery? And how is he dealing with this America struggling with a post-emancipation world? And so I went through at the National Archives, the records of the Freedmen's Bureau for Texas. And I found this letter to the Texas superintendent of the Freedmen's Bureau from I think it was a surgeon in one of the regiments that Custer commanded there, about how this 9-year-old Black girl had come 23 miles from a plantation in the countryside of the town where Custer had his headquarters to find her mother. And that this girl had been held in de facto slavery for months after Juneteenth. And that the woman who ran the household where she'd been enslaved send her teenage son in to bring the girl back or kill her. And so the boy literally pried the girl off her mother, tied her to his horse, and then rode through the countryside, dragging her until she died. So, Custer, it was a moment of a choice. It was a dilemma for Custer. He is the occupying officer. He's in charge of martial law. What is he going to do? And then what does that say about America? What does it say about his attitudes toward race? And so, going into that, that's a moment where we want to know, it's an authentic moment of suspense, an authentic moment. As Rebecca said, you don't want to make the reader feel like you're playing a gimmick, but saying, okay, what's happening? Why is he going to make the choice that he makes? What's going on in America, et cetera. And then opening that up, looking at it, and then coming back to that moment. And that there are times when you can have a moment where it poses a dilemma, where there's some outcome is expected. And if you can authentically use that moment to then explore something that's important, that's a great way to do it. I waited until Custer was actually facing a line of Cheyenne warriors before I talked about the background of the High Plains nations and that conflict, because a lot of books will start with, okay, now Custer went west. Let's have 20 pages on, Native history. And you feel like you're eating your broccoli to get to the dessert. Exactly. Instead of a sense of this knowledge is laying out the stakes. It's a part of a narrative. It's propelling me forward instead of just baggage I have to drag along. Like I like to say, the contextual information, you need to make it a part of the propulsion mechanism. It can't just be dead freight that you're dragging along. The reader has to be invested in it. And so suspense is a way of, if you use it well and it feels authentic and organic, then building suspense and then opening it up is a way of getting to things that are important to you, as opposed to just simply, now it's time for this, now it's time for that, which is, I think, lazy writing.
And I think that letter and your retelling of the story behind that letter, coming where it does in the book, is crucial timing for just what you're saying. It's not only the suspense of the murder of a 9-year-old girl, but Custer's inaction, action, and well, which way is he going to go? You don't leave it for very long, but it gives you the chance to open up and talk about so many of the big themes of the book: the professional army, the victory of the war, but then can he succeed? Can he make good on his success? Rebecca, one of the things that you do, I think, really brilliantly from the very beginning is much of what TJ is just saying, harnessing history as an engine, so that for those of you who are working on biographies now, if you pick up the first page of All the Frequent Troubles, you'll see, again, like what Larry Wright says about 9/11, we know the planes are going to hit the towers. We know the towers, unfortunately, are going to fall. We know where this book is going to go. We think we know something about the rise of National Socialism. But what you do so well, Rebecca, is in present tense, literally rewind the film. Rewind, bring those letters, fragments, the ashes back to life in a way that is absolutely authentic, historically accurate, and captivating. And of course, your heroine and hero, her husband, Arvid, are front and center in that. But it doesn't come across as artificial. It doesn't come across in any way as wooden. Can you speak a little bit about when you realized that was the way to go? Was there a battle?
Yes, well, it's interesting. I think that there are often missed opportunities in the elements of a book that typically function as workhorses, and are often ignored for their potential to function in ways that are surprising. So the author's note is a perfect example of this. We tend to think of the author's note as providing rudimentary details about research or discussing the internal set of rules that you're following in writing this biography. And in mine, I describe how I can follow the conventions of narrative nonfiction, that any words that appeared between quotation marks come directly from a primary source document, a letter, a memoir, a diary, etc. So I do that. I also explain that the somewhat unorthodox structure that I devised for this book. I have 2 narrative lines. And when TJ was talking about characters and also how the characters can enrich your narrative about the focus of your biography and also enable you to employ suspense, I think that's something that's a very important point to underscore too. In following these 2 narrative lines, both Mildred and then her 11-year-old courier, this little American boy who I tracked down when he was 89. And he was the son of a diplomat at the US Embassy of Berlin who had a special arrangement with Morgenthau and Sumner Wells and Cordell Hull to obtain information from key sources in Berlin. When I tracked him down and interviewed him, I realized I needed to include him in this book, not just as a chapter, but really tell his story kind of in parallel with Mildred's. So I explain this in the author's note. And then finally, I explain that the title of the book, All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, is taken from a poem by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe that Mildred was translating. And I call attention to the controversy about whether it should be troubles or trouble. This has been sort of something that scholars quibble over. And then I mention that Mildred was translating this Goethe poem in her prison cell with a pencil in a damp prison cell, and that it's really, there's no really definitive way that we can ascertain whether there is an S or not. Anyway, so I'm going with the S. But I'm introducing suspense right there in that very explanation of, I'm making a point. I want to sort of say for the record, this is why I am calling this book and this was Mildred's translation. Translation is an art, not a science. So, and she had a kind of loose way also of translating things. So whether there is an S or not, I can sort of, I will call attention to that. And then, but the fact that I'm already providing these visceral details, like a damp prison cell. And then I mentioned that immediately, the reader is going to wonder about that prison cell and how did she get there and what happens. And perhaps the reader might wonder, how did we get this book? And so the very last part of this author's note, I explain that the prison chaplain, Harald Pulschau, who was in the resistance, watched her. He entered her cell and he saw her bent over this book of Goethe poems, and he saw her translating these poems. And I don't, and I go back to eliding information. I don't explain
it
at that point that she's executed within an hour. I don't explain exactly what Pulschau's involvement in this underground resistance group is. I just mentioned, the location of it. And so I leave a lot, I employ sort of, this omission of information as a way of engaging the reader's interest. Well, wait a second. So what happens when, what happens next? But I mean, to put it bluntly, and that's just in the author's note. And so, I mean, I've accomplished a few things in a very short number of paragraphs. It's really just a page and a half. So, instead of just providing this sort of basic information about my narrative approach and my research, I also at the very end sort of sneak in a kind of a story that then I'm going to pick up later on. And so I would say that it took me almost a year to figure that out of drafts. And initially I thought, I wasn't sure if I was going to do an author's note and an introduction and then chapter 1, whether I would combine an author's note and an introduction. So I played with all these different ways of doing this. And then in my introduction, I go into more detail. And again, I tell this in a narrative way. I provide the reader a glimpse of the courtroom where she was was she was tried for treason. And then I do disclose in that introduction that on February 16th, 1943, she was brought to a guillotine and beheaded. And then I switched to all of the archival research that I did.
We don't come back to that for over 400 pages. In between, we see the rise, the accretion of National Socialism in a way that is very fresh. And the walls are closing in and in on her, and the claustrophobia of her surrounding her life, so that the oxygen, in a way that as the character's psychology is deepening and as the emotional vectors grow stronger and stronger, I felt she has no choice. Right. It's a kind of a double helix of there is the ineluctability, there is no choice here. And you turn that page and a half. Thank you for the page and a half. Your explanation of that, the birth of that. I think Mr. Carroll spent a lot longer trying to figure out that point of view, switch to Mr. Humphrey. Then you turn the page and you see fragment. And the book is a book of fragments. Yeah, you could have printed that questionnaire. Right,
I'm glad you brought that up, Andrew. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, so that's another archival document.
I'm assuming that all 119 of you have read both books. Sorry, I don't want to give anything away, but the whole point is there is no suspense. It's all built in the writing.
We're giving it all away. No, but that's actually another sort of use of an archival document that does create suspense. So what could I have done? And this was her prison questionnaire that she filled out shortly before she was executed. And there were numerous pages, and there were questions that were not only just what is your name? Where were you born? What is your birth date? What are your parents' names? But also questions that really indicate a lot about the Nazi regime and their priorities and their obsessions. Questions like, did you go to a school for the mentally retarded was one of them. Do you have excessive passions? And that kind of thing. And I thought I could just present this all at once, or I could piecemeal it and present it throughout the book and sort of lead the reader along through, and over the course of the narrative. The reader then wonders, especially after you see it the second time. And I call all those sections, I call them fragments. So I give you a little fragment, and then, X number of pages later, I give you another fragment, and then X number of pages later, I give you another fragment. And then over the totality of the book, you then get the full document. But I tried to be artful about which parts of the fragment that I would introduce. So often I would try to find elements such as, the question about schooling, that then what comes after that is something about how the Nazi regime approached schooling, so that there are these thematic bridges, really. And so that was something that was really useful for me. But of course, when you start a book out with a fragment of a questionnaire that says, basically, why are you, the last question, and there are about 4 I do in that first one, is why are you in prison now? What crime did you commit? And it's high treason. And that's how it ends. So that also introduces the reader, right up front, really nails what's the point? Why is she there? Right. And then of course the reader is going to ask eventually, how did she get here?
That's a perfect segue back to TJ. At what point did you realize? So you've been to the archives, you've got 30 odd boxes, bankers boxes filled with paper. At what point do you realize, I'm not going to tell Little Bighorn? The ending is the beginning. And actually, what you're both talking about here is the inevitability of the end. We all die.
Yeah,
what point did you realize, I'm not going to tell it until the epilogue?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. There's a couple of things that I just want to respond to that Rebecca raised. One is just the importance of having details and then really being thoughtful about how you use them. And that goes to your research. Sometimes you have characters or periods in which a subject and periods in that subject's life in which you just don't know a lot. This was true with, pardon me, my first biography of Jesse James was a fugitive his entire life. And so, you know, you need to find ways of, you know, creating a, sometimes contextually, sometimes with other characters, you know, creating a sense of what that world was like. Sometimes you use telling details to create a sense of mood, to create expectations. I remember when I was working on my second biography, The First Tycoon, The Epic Life of Cornelius Vanderbilt, I had a fellowship at the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library, which brings together, you know, people who are academic scholars, fiction writers, poets, playwrights, all kinds of people. And so I workshopped a chapter, and Vanderbilt was lying in a ditch after a train wreck in the 1830s on the edge of death. And I mentioned a detail about how this meteor had flamed overhead, and everybody was talking about it. And to be honest, I just put it in because it was an interesting detail that people were talking about. And Nathan Englander, the novelist, said, "You realize that connects Vanderbilt to the universe. Is that what you want to do?" And of course, you know, he's thinking like a fiction writer, like a writer. And I thought, no, actually, that's not what I want to say. You know, Vanderbilt was a very unspiritual guy, and gritty determination got him through that moment, not, you know, the universe. And so I took it out, even though it was a colorful detail. And when I got to Custer's trials, and he's out in his first expedition in the West, and he's dealing with the fact that he's going into a kind of combat he's not prepared for, the commander who's making mistakes. There's all kinds of tension in the military side of things. But meanwhile, he's screwing up his marriage by cheating on his wife. And there's this underlying tension that his marriage is about to explode. And so he keeps writing. I talked about how he kept writing to his wife, you know, saying everything's going to be fine. We're going to have this great post at the end of the year, and it'll all be great again. And then he mentions these details when he's out on this first expedition on the Great Plains, you know, an owl coming out of a prairie dog village, a buffalo skeleton. They're all kind of eerie. And he goes in that most amazing of Western sights, the mirage. And, you know, I just put that out there. It was a quote from the time, and yet it creates the sense that he is creating his own mirage, of course. And if I talked about it at all, it would have ruined it. But, you know, it's a detail. You find your details and you think about their use and whether you should include that detail or not, and how you're going to parcel it out. And so, you know, dealing with the end, you know, the known outcome, and thinking about how do I tell this story fresh that's been told so many ways before. You know, I made a deliberate decision pretty early on that the book was not going to go into detail about the thing that every Custer biography is about, which is the Little Bighorn. Mm-hmm. And that was going to be a story. We sort of lose sight of Custer when he literally goes over the horizon at the end of the last chapter.
Literally.
And then I pick up the epilogue with this trial over who was at fault, basically the court of inquiry for his second in command, Major Reno. And the story is really not of the Little Bighorn. It's of Americans after his death trying to figure out what happened. And that in a sense, that is what we're doing with this life. We're trying to figure out what happened and what it meant, and who was he, and how did things work out. And the court of inquiry is focused on the small event, but the larger question is, it sort of ties into the larger question of the book, which is how did he get there? Not what decisions did he make that day? That's not really the interesting question. And so thinking about how you're framing your biography, and there's so many ways to do biography, but how you're framing it, the questions that are important to you, how you would like the reader to experience it. I didn't want the reader to experience the Little Bighorn as my version of a omniscient narrative in which, I know what happened, because I don't. I was more interested in the fractured, incomplete, unreliable narrative of what happened at that battlefield. And that's why I've gotten some criticism because I left out native accounts of what happened. But that's actually, for my purposes in this book, that was beside the point. That was not the story I was telling. It's an important story, critically important.
We're almost out of time. And I think what you're getting at is one of the same things that I thought, commonalities. You're both writing about people who died very young, died violent deaths, and yet the moment of their death, you almost elide. TJ, you have the women watching, I think, as the men marched out in silence or in darkness. And Rebecca, you have similarly women hearing the jangle of keys, and then there's an absence. It's the quiet. It's not the violence. This is where the women go, where they will be beheaded, but we don't see it. There are a couple of questions very quickly, so apologies to those who put them in the chat. TJ, are you familiar? I imagine the answer is yes. With Evan Cannell's Custer book. What are your thoughts? Maybe we can follow up on email. And an important question, you talked a little bit about it, Rebecca, in structure, when you decided to use the first person, present tense.
I was on mute there. Yes, I'll address that, or TJ, do you want to take your, okay. Very briefly, yes, so I made a decision early on to write my book in the present tense. And I think that just in the context of suspense, I had a number of reasons for doing so, which I don't think I'll have time to go into right now, but it did serve the purpose of creating a lot of suspense. My main reason was that I wanted to bring readers to the streets of Berlin to have them experience the collapse of democracy and the rise of fascism as if they were standing beside Mildred. And I feel that it was important for the events and themes in this book to feel as if they were happening right now, not as some kind of sepia tone, dust-caked thing of the past, but something that is very indeed topical right now as we see threats to our democracy in the present day. And so by writing it in the present tense, I was able to bring a sense of immediacy into the story and also suspense. So if I'm just writing, readers have a sense of, if anybody knows anything about the history, they'll know what happened during the Nazi regime, even at just the broad strokes. But by writing it in the present tense, there's always that sense of of immediacy and engages that question of when is the next thing going to happen? Is it going to happen on the next page or the next chapter? And it allows me to slow down as a writer and explain these actions that often get very compressed in histories of the resistance. This way I can sort of draw it out moment by moment, explain, again, using primary source documentation. I have a description of how the resistors in her group engaged in espionage, and incredible first-person accounts of meeting their control officers and exchanging either documents or radio transmitters. And these are, there's one memoir in particular that I utilized for that. And the way that she wrote this scene was as if it was a novel. And so in a moment by moment way in the present tense. Exactly. So that's another sort of tool that you can employ is just playing around with chronology, either delaying linear resolution by going to another narrative line, or subverting the reader's expectation by changing the verb tense, flashing back, flashing forward, just sort of basic tools of narrative architecture that can be used in biography, not just in thrillers.
Beautiful, thank you. We could talk for another hour. This has been phenomenally enjoyable, entertaining, and I hope instructional as well. Thank you both again. It's really been an honor. And if you haven't, please go out and read their books. I'm sure you already have, though, most of you. Thanks again, TJ. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.